How does the Supreme Court use the case of Tinker v. Des Moines to advocate for a quality public education for U.S. students? In this lesson, you will learn to analyze the connection between constitutional principle and public advocacy by examining legal reasoning in a text. Let's review. In the case of Tinker v. Des Moines, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Tinker that represented a group of students. The court supported the rights of these students to protest in a public school by wearing black armbands in opposition to the Vietnam War. The question arises, what does it mean to be publicly educated? What are the rights and the responsibilities of students in the public education system? In the United States, the purpose is to develop citizens that will help the nation grow and develop. Here, we seek to develop a diverse group of people using a multiplicity of methods. Not every country is like us. Sparta, for example, is an ancient civilization whose purpose of education was to develop a strong military. Everyone was expected to have a perfect body and speak and behave in the same way. Today, we're going to closely examine how constitutional principles develop institutions by following these 3 steps. First, we're going to identify a section of text in which the court advocates for a public institution. Second, we're going to note how the court demonstrates the connection between the constitutional principle and public institutions. Third, ask yourself, what effect will this constitutional principle have on the institution? The first thing we need to do is find a section of text where the court advocates for a public institution. Throughout the text, the court advocates for the community of American schools. Here, they're advocating that schools develop leaders who are given an exposure to many ideas that come from a multitude of tongues. The court is advocating for free speech connected activities that should take place in schools. How does the court demonstrate the connection between the public institution of the school and the constitutional principle of freedom of speech? Well, returning to the text, I see that the court draws on a precedent of Sparta. They essentially call upon Sparta as an example of how constitutional principles develop public institutions. And they do this by highlighting how the ideas about who an individual was in relation to the state they were a part of are totally different from our ideas about individuals and who they are in relation to the state. This essentially explains that institutions are created by ideas. The principles and the ideas that a state holds to create the institutions that make up that state. They finally highlight that we could not hold fast to the ideas of Sparta without doing violence both to what our Constitution says and to the spirit of what it means. Therefore, the ideas need to be defended. In the case of Tinker versus Des Moines, we need to defend the idea that students are guaranteed the constitutional rights that are granted to all U.S. citizens. If we don't defend this idea, our institutions of the school itself will begin to fall apart. and create a different kind of state. So, what effect will the constitutional principle that students do have rights to practice their First Amendment rights to speech and freedom of expression, how will that affect American schools? Reminding ourselves of the original quote we highlighted in our first step, I can predict that if we hold fast to these ideals, to this idea and principle of freedom of speech, that our schools will become more student-centered, our schools will offer diverse curriculum, and that our schools will encourage questioning and exploration. So, what have we learned about how the Supreme Court used this case to advocate for quality public education for all U.S. students? By reviewing the text and really analyzing the text through my notes and questioning, I've learned that the Supreme Court does not simply use the case of Tinker versus Des Moines to defend a single student protest. The court crafts their opinion to protect an idea of what public education should look like in the United States. They argue that while freedom of expression may inspire fear or discomfort among school authorities and administration, free speech activities actually strengthen and invigorate the school's overall ability to develop active and competent citizens. By following these steps, first, identifying the section of text in which the court advocates for a public institution. Second, noting how the court demonstrates the connection between the constitutional principle and public institutions. And third, asking ourselves, what effect will this constitutional principle have on the institution? We have learned that in this lesson, you have learned to analyze the connection between the constitutional principle and public advocacy by examining legal reasoning in a text.